could make it today. So welcome to the second to the last Paul class. So we're going to do 2 Corinthians today. Again, it's the sequel. Low expectations on the sequel. And then we've got one more week. We'll finish up with the biggie, like his theological treatise. It's Romans. It's big, it's hard. People spend their entire lives studying letters to the Romans. And we're going to get through that one next week, and then we'll finish up. And I'll again invite you all to join us with Maureen teaching Introduction to Process Theology for the next 5 weeks after that. We do have a couple of those books available online. I'll also put the name and title in this week's email with the slides if you'd like to join along with that. And then while Maureen's teaching that class, I'll start preparing the Luke Bible study. So next, we're going to take on Luke, and I think many of you are going to find that one deeply meaningful. It's one of my favorites. There are stories in Luke that aren't anywhere else. And so we'll do it the same way we've done all the books. I'll start with an introductory class talking about the context, the time frame, Luke's community, the historical background of that community. And then we'll take each week, we'll take it as chunks. So we'll take that from March, mid-March into May. We'll go through Luke, and that'll match up with a lot of the preaching over that time will be on Luke. And then it sounds like what I'm going to do is come back in the fall and do Reformation history. So I was thinking about it after our last conversation, and there's so much history of the Reformation. I just assume everybody knows because everybody studied that, right? So, but it's really, really good stuff. So I think I'm going to do probably a 3-week class on history of the Reformation in the fall. And then I'm looking at either going back to the Hebrew Bible for some prophet study, Genesis or Genesis. So I need some input on that one. If you want to think on that one, what we should do for our follow-up after we do Reformation history in the fall, what would be a good book to study? So if you want to do some thinking about that, feel free to let me know, okay? It was because of you all that we did Paul. I would not have done this of my own free will. So I thank you for the ideas that got us into ancient Christianity and Paul. This has been a lot of fun. I'm very thankful for that. So let me go ahead and start my slideshow here. So Paul only wrote 7 letters, right? Y'all know this one. We have been through 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, Galatians. You all made it through Galatians. We are on 2 Corinthians, and we will finish with Paul's letter to the Romans. Things we need to remember. We're going to trust Paul's actions as evidence of his commitments. That's a big one. Also recognizing that we all look through our own lenses when it comes to Paul. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Corinth. I'll tell you that this Sunday I am preaching on 1 Corinthians. And so I am talking a little bit about the community of Corinth, because I think it's important to know who Paul is talking to. So you have all seen this before, but just a reminder of what Corinth was like, right? So this is a community that grew up from freed slaves. And the easiest way to say what Corinth was to remember that what happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth. So casinos, brothels, theater, it was conspicuous consumption central for ancient Roman times. So Paul started a community in Corinth. It was one of his first ones. And remember, Corinth was really, really strategically located. It was about 50 miles from Athens. And because it was on that weird isthmus, it was the center of so much very strategic trade. So here's what we know about Paul's time in Corinth. So he stayed there for almost a year and a half when he was on his second missionary journey. So that was sometime between the year 50 and 53. And Paul came to this community, you know, ancient times Las Vegas, and he lived and worked there for a year and a half. So he worked as a tent maker. And he was responsible for creating this incredibly diverse congregation. So they were diverse ethnically, and they were diverse socially, and they were diverse economically. This is almost entirely a Gentile community. So you've seen this meme before. This was Paul writing to the Corinthians. In the first letter, you're going to find that this very much carries through for Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Okay, there's a lot of background on this letter. So let's talk a little bit about the background. Paul founded the church in Corinth, right? We know he went, he lived, he created this beautiful community. After leaving, he wrote them a letter. That letter has been lost. We don't have it. And then he got reports. He had some visitors who came and gave him an update on what was happening in Corinth, and he was upset about it. And he wanted to offer coaching, reinforcement of teaching, course correction. So he writes 1 Corinthians, right? That is a well-organized letter. He takes on, you know, sexual morality, he takes on excommunication, he takes on the resurrection, the Last Supper, very coordinated, well-prepared letter. 1 Corinthians. After Paul sends that letter, things get messy. Paul comes back to Corinth, and it appears that maybe he didn't tell him he was coming, and they were unaware that he was coming. So there's some surprise that he shows up there, right? He has some type of a confrontation with people that he thinks are sinning. And somebody did something to Paul that he believes was intended to hurt or humiliate him. So creates the beloved community in Corinth, goes away, hears about some problems, writes 1 Corinthians, and then drops in on them. And it is a bad visit. His feelings are hurt. He feels
tried last week.
Sorry about that. That's done a couple times today. Let me get my screen back. Okay, so he has this visit, and then he leaves in a huff, and he cancels his plans to come back. So not only does he leave in a huff, but he says, basically, screw you, I'm not coming back. Now, this makes some in the Corinthians community upset because they're like, look, this guy's a flake, right? So there's some are saying he's a flake. Paul's saying, my tender feelings were hurt. I do not want to be hurt again. I am not going back, right? So this beloved community that he created, that relationship is crumbling. That's when 2 Corinthians is written them. So it is not, you know, 1 Corinthians, he writes the letter to a community that he loves. And some things are happening and he wants to set them on the straight road right away. That is a letter solid in love. 2 Corinthians, things have gone downhill. And he's not writing from this position of love. He's writing from a position of confrontation and hurt feelings and misunderstandings. Okay, so some other things that had happened prior to Paul writing this letter. he had something really bad had happened to him. We don't know what it is, but he had experienced some terrible trial. And he calls it, he makes a reference to it, deadly peril. We know Paul was in prison several times. It might have been this. We don't know what is going on. But Paul gets word that this individual who hurt his feelings and humiliated him has repented, and he's willing to reach back out. And that's why he's going to send that second letter to express his relief and joy and to encourage and console this person who was hurt his feelings and was disciplined. This is one of my favorite memes, though, to really sum up what happens between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It's complicated. I love the cigarette in that one. Okay, couple things to be aware of in this letter. It is a sequel. It is disappointing. It is not prepared the way 1 Corinthians was. 1 Corinthians just organized topically, easy to read. 2 Corinthians is going to wander all over the place, and you're going to have times when he is happy, times when he's humiliated, times when he's hurt, he's hopeful, he's horrified. He's hit everything in this letter. And even with all of that, 2 Corinthians is one of his most studied letters. Okay, so the letter is written about a year after 1 Corinthians, so sometime around the end of the 50s. Now, there's different theories that biblical scholars have on this letter as to why it is so confusing. One theory is that he wrote it while he was on the move. So he didn't sit down and write it all at once. He wrote it when he could sit and write as he was traveling. And that's why it appears so fragmented. Other biblical scholars, though, think this is not one cohesive letter, but it is many letters written at different times. And there are some that believe this is up to 5 different letters in here. And we have it all just understood as 2 Corinthians. There is some stuff to fall in love with here. His opening prayer is beautiful. He also does this testimony to Christian hope. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So this, I think, is as close as you're going to come to a theology of heaven for Paul. This very hopeful belief of building a house made by God for God's people, and the accompaniment of the Spirit until that happens. This also has some of the Bible's earliest references to the divinity of Christ. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of this gospel or the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So that's going to be an important one as the battles over who Christ was heat up. Okay, Paul's back to doing an opening. So, he cut that in Galatians and went right to the jugular. He's back with an opening on this one, but it's a lot about him. So it really is a story of his sufferings. Then he goes into his thanksgiving. And then he's going to talk about his relations with this community, this whole visit deferral, this tearful letter that he wrote, and his ministry with them. And then he's going to talk about money. And then he's going to talk about people who are going to challenge his authority. So we saw a lot of that last week in Galatians. It's going to come back here. 3 big themes: his ministry, fundraising, and challenges to his authority. So the bulk of this letter, though, is related to the character and content of his ministry. So Again, think about what we were talking about when we started this, about the context from which Paul is writing this letter. He's not writing to a community that he's close with. This isn't First Thessalonians and the Dear John, I miss you letter, right? He's not writing to Corinthians of a year ago. He's writing to a community where this relationship is falling apart. His legacy is falling apart, right? So he wants to reinforce who he is. So who he's not. He's not a peddler of God's words. He's not a self-promoter. He doesn't falsify God's words. He does not use the gospel to his own advantage. He does operate with sincerity, and he behaves in this life in ways that reveal him to be a true servant of God and ambassador of Christ. So he's almost like taking out a little commercial for himself. And then he's reinforcing, his relationship with this community that he founded. He is committed to them emotionally and professionally. He loves them. This conflict, this deterioration of their relationship is causing him deep pain. And then he talks about their relationship of almost as if it's unrequited love, right? We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. I will most gladly spend and be spent for you. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? So the language, this is almost like a love letter to the Corinthians. And Paul, and then we saw this in Galatians, right? His ministry is of God, and it's really important to Paul. People know that. He was selected to do this work. He was sent by God to do God's work, and God is working through him to accomplish this. So Paul, again, is establishing his authority. He doesn't have his authority because the apostles signed off on a certificate for him, right? He doesn't have the authority because James in Jerusalem said, you can go do this. His authority comes straight from God, and that authority hinges on his witness to Christ's resurrection. Who saw the resurrection? Paul. Paul was a witness to the resurrection. So God's working through him to accomplish all of this. And what is the work? Bring a new covenant, a new creation. When Christ rose from the dead, it created a new world order. And Paul is about bringing that forward. Okay, Paul talks a little bit about this paradox. And here's what he says. But we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Christ, so that the love of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us. Sorry about that. Okay, so it's a paradox. Both things are going to be true. And Paul does this through this imagery of old jars in clay. So too the gospel can be carried by frail and fragile agents like Paul, whose lives exhibit that paradox that the gospel holds. So Paul's basically saying he is like that. He's a paradox. Both things are true. Life, death, fragility, strength, that is Paul as well. Okay, Paul then goes into raising money. And this is a big chunk of the letter. And he puts almost 2 chapters are devoted to this collection Paul is taking for the poor in Jerusalem. And Paul is saying this is not just an act of charity, but this is really symbolic to demonstrate unity with the Gentiles and the Jews, right? So who's in Jerusalem? The Jews. By offering this gift of funds, it's demonstrating what matters most to Paul, Christian unity. This act, for Paul, love is an act. It is doing, is just like Jesus being on the way. It is an act of demonstrating love, Christian unity. And Paul thinks that giving is a privilege, that it is a favor from God to be able to do this. And this is where Paul's almost getting into like the economics of Christianity, that it's critical that there be this sharing of resources so that there should be nobody who should either have excess or want among God's people. So Paul is the ultimate socialist, probably, right? Fair and equitable distribution of resources, nobody at the high end, nobody at the low end, right? So this is Paul's economic. And he believes Paul should be a cheerful giver, meaning it should be voluntary. You should not do this because you feel like you have to. You should do this because this should be something that matters to you. That's Paul's philosophy on giving. But knowing Paul, we also know that Paul is not above manipulation, right? And he's going to get manipulative. And basically, Paul's going to say this beautiful treatise about why it matters to give, right? Because nobody should have excess, nobody should want. It's a demonstration of unity, it's a demonstration of love, so beautiful. Oh, and by the way, the Macedonians are showing you up. So they're given a lot and you look cheap and you're not following through on what we believe. So Paul's not above being manipulative, right? So he throws in a couple little digs for them about not being shown up by their neighbors. But then he'll bring it back and say, no, but really this needs to be inspired by the gift of Christ. That as Christ lived out his life, so we live out ours in that giving. And then this beautiful kind of closing, which people are stewards, are caretakers of all that they receive from God. So all we receive in life is a gift of God. We are a steward of that. And if we are blessed, we will want to use what we have received to help others. So it's very similar to like Paul talking about why do you do right in the world? Why do you do good in the world? Not because you're required to do it, but because you have basically this wellspring of love that is overflown. And of course it spills out in the world. That's the logical kind of living out of that love. Okay, challenges to authority. You saw this up close and personal in Galatians. He is not going to back down on this, right? He's not going to yield any of his authority. He has been given divine authority to punish the disobedient, right? So who did Christ appear to? Paul. Who has God commissioned? Paul. Included in that is not only forming communities, teaching, preaching, living out the gospel, but it also includes punishing the disobedient. So this is the first time you've seen that. We did see some of the excommunication language in 1 Corinthians, but this is more, and we're heading towards the end of Paul's life too, right? And all of his work and everything. And you're seeing some harshness come in regarding the judgment and the disobedience. And it goes on. So I warned those who sinned previously and all the others, and I warn them now while absent, as I did when present on my second visit, that if I come again, I will not be lenient. Now, even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up, not for tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. And I do not want to seem as though I'm trying to frighten you with my letters. So, little take back at the end. Okay, the other thing that comes up in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians is the thorn in his flesh. So this was in chapter 12. There's a lot of work that's been done about this. What was the thorn in Paul's chest, in Paul's flesh? Here's the citation, chapter 12. Even because of extraordinary character of the revelations, therefore, so that I would not become arrogant, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to trouble me, so that I would not become arrogant. I asked the Lord 3 times about this, that it would depart from me. But he said to me, my grace is enough for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So then I will boast more gladly about my weakness, so that the power of Christ may reside in me. So something has afflicted Paul, and he wants it gone. And he prayed to God to have it gone. And the message he got is that weakness actually makes you stronger. So there's a lot of work that's been done about, and theories about what this was. In the 2nd century, there was a lot of belief that it was chronic headaches. And remember, any medical affliction at this time was believed to be from God, right? And if it was a serious negative affliction that was impacting you, it was because you did something wrong, right? 3rd century, they believed it was because he had a difficult wife. So W-I-F-E. Yep. So that was the 3rd century belief. He had a difficult wife. That was the thorn in his flesh. 4th century, that it was one of his opponents. And we know from Galatians, Paul had some big opponents, right, who did not agree with him. Martin Luther and John Calvin in the 16th century believed it was sexual temptation, that he was sexually desiring of somebody, and that was the thorn in his flesh. And a lot of the Protestant, I think, repressive sexual beliefs that flowed out of the Reformation with the early Protestants really comes from this belief here, that it was the affliction for Paul. Here's some other theories. The book I told you about that was written by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan believes that it was malaria. That after Paul got his vision on the road to Damascus, and remember he disappears for a couple years, they believe he actually got malaria and was quite ill during that time. There are biblical scholars that believe that he was gay and he had desires for men, and this was his thorn in the flesh. Some believe he had a really guilty conscience from his early days persecuting Christian followers. Speech impediment, kind of similar to Moses. We talked about the poor eyesight last week with Galatians, and some believe he had epilepsy. We do not know. Acts does not provide any clarity to this, but theologians throughout the centuries have done a lot with this. And I think, unfortunately, it's been used poorly to rationalize suffering, that it leads to kind of that this sense of suffering is redemptive, that suffering has a purpose. So this is kind of one of the kingpins that undermines that sense of suffering has a purpose, which again, I hope I've been very clear on. I don't think suffering has a purpose. I do believe that purpose can be mined from suffering. So This is one of my favorite memes, though. What was truly the thorn in the flesh was in imagining that Paul was in jail with SpongeBob SquarePants. That was truly the thorn in the flesh. Okay, Paul gets the last word. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all consolation, who consoles us all in our affliction, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction, with the consolation with which we ourselves are consoled by God. For just as the sufferings of Christ are abundant for us, so also our consolation is abundant through Christ. If we are being afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation. If we are being consoled, it is for your consolation, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we are also suffering. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our suffering, so also you share in our consolation. So I really love this part right up here. The God who consoles us in our affliction, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction. So it's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment that Paul kind of wraps it up with. So hard letter, not easily read. And it doesn't include any of the big theological statements. It is a letter written during a time of pain and conflict, and the relationship is deteriorating, and Paul isn't really able to step out and love them the way he did in 1 Corinthians. He's a very human apostle, and he's showing us humanness here. Okay, thoughts, reactions, questions, 2 Corinthians. Let's start with you, Paul.
Is there, I've never heard a mention of his wife. He excuse me, he does all this traveling. I mean, that's about all he does, right? And there's no mention of her with him. And nor is there any mention of him being gay?
None. Neither of the wife or of him being gay. And it could be just like with Jesus, that being married in first century Roman times was kind of like having ears. So why would you mention it, right? Because of course everybody has ears, right? So there's some people that believe that's why there's no mention of Christ's wife, because why would you need to? Everybody's married, right? What would have been noteworthy is if he didn't have a wife, Paul or Jesus. That would have been really noteworthy, and you would have heard about that. But there is no mention of Paul's wife. And Paul mentions a lot of women in his letters, and it's not clear if any of them are his wife.
Okay.
No.
So are these just really best guesses? Thank you.
Yeah. Biblical scholars kind of tearing through the letters and also studying the word choices and the Hebrew and the Greek translations. Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I have a different take on some of this. I found the parts where he was doing his fundraising things, especially when he was trying to guilt them into it. It reminded me of some of the things that televangelists are always coming across with. And I also felt, I mean, I'm sure he had suffering, but it seemed like he did an awful lot of complaining about it in this thing. He kept going back and back and back to it. And that seemed sort of like overkill to me.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a very confusing.
Yeah.
I also want to know, because Paul is not supposed to have written the other letters from Paul, would it be worthwhile for us to look at them and study them? Or maybe less so because we don't know where they come from?
So there are some great letters. There are also some horrific letters. Like the Timothy letters have some really, really painful misogynist stuff in there. But it's I believe it's all stuff that we kind of ignore at our own peril. It's good to know what they are and to know what the community is and why they might have been written the way they were written. So yeah, so I think you know, I would definitely be game for taking on the rest of the letters. I think there's 7 more because we've done Revelations already. And that includes things like James, which is an amazing letter, and First John, which is one of the most beautiful love letters ever written. So there's some great stuff that wasn't written by Paul, but really demonstrates some powerful theology that came out of the first century. So yeah, I think that would be interesting to go back and do some learning on those. And yes, he's particularly whiny in this letter. He is. And you can tell it's either, and I think it makes sense, it's either he wrote it at multiple different times, or it's multiple different letters that just got all merged together. It doesn't flow. So yeah. Bernie, did you have one?
Yeah, a couple of real quick questions. Did you not say at the very beginning that Paul did not personally know Jesus?
Correct.
He followed him by a decade or so. Okay,
Correct.
Secondly, earlier you said that Paul, when writing this letter, was getting older. Do we know how and when Paul died?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that next week when we go to Romans, because but basically here's what happens. His last big trip is supposedly going to be, he's planning to go to Rome. And so he writes the letter to Romans as an introduction. This is the only letter he's going to write to people who don't know him. So he's basically, it's his dating profile. But instead of all the reasons why you should love Paul, though he includes those, it's his theology. So it is the letter that includes Paul's theology, all prepared together. It's why that letter is the most studied, the richest, the one that everybody gravitates to it for biblical scholarship. Paul writes that letter. He goes to the Roman community. There are some myths, stories that he continues on and goes to Spain, which was what his goal. Most biblical scholars believe, though, he dies in Rome around the time that Peter dies. And in its reaction to some big fires, and Nero is looking for basically a scapegoat. So he blames the Christians and he rounds them up. And most scholars believe Paul and Peter were in that roundup, and that's how they died.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're nearing the end here. Go ahead, Diane.
Well, I found this letter really, really interesting. First of all, it has some beautiful phrasing in it. And it really does. I mean, some of the words just flow from him in the descriptions. And the other, I guess, because I felt like I learned who Paul was. I mean, like you talked about, the humanness of him. I mean,
Yeah.
and knowing the context of, you know, what had happened to him, who'd done him wrong and all of that. We didn't know that. But, you know, I mean, his complaining and his poor me and his mea culpa, and then, but I love you and we do all this stuff for you and I'm asking for money. And I just felt like he seemed more real to me from this particular letter. And certainly then he touts himself as like the only messenger from God and Christ, right? He is the numero uno. I mean, he became real for me from this letter.
Yeah. Very human, very human, with all the messy humanness of him, right? You know, and that's why he's a great example of a saint. Boy, he was a jerk. And then he figured out a way forward, you know, to live into what he felt God was calling him into. And even in doing all of that, man, his ego got in the way time after time. He loved beautifully and he loved poorly. I mean, that's like the story of everybody. That's like our story, right? That's my story. And so there's something really, I think, powerful in what you're saying, that there's a humanness of
Right.
Paul's writing that comes through here.
Exactly. And then when he ends about, if you don't get things fixed and I come back, look out. What?
Yeah.
I mean, what was he going to do to them? What? I mean,
Yeah.
what was he going to do with them, to them, if they didn't behave? I mean, I wish I knew what he was going to do. It was like a cliffhanger,
And there were probably letters after that we don't have. The story of Paul's relationship with Corinth is a tricky one, because we only have just a tiny peep into that. It's just not sufficient to tell the story that's there. Chuck, were you going to say something? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I just wondered if there are any letters from others to Paul that we know about.
No. What was preserved, so it sounds like what happened was the churches preserved and passed around Paul's letters, and started to extrapolate that guidance to other communities. So what was irrelevant was who wrote to Paul. What quickly became relevant was Paul's guidance to the communities, and that's why those letters were preserved.
Thank you.
Don't you think it's kind of strange that the church would pass around a letter that kind of told them they were not any good?
Well, think about the Gospels. There's some unflattering stuff in the Gospels too about the disciples, and they kept those. So yes, there are things in those letters, like why did the letter to the Galatians get preserved, right? You would think if you were a Galatian, it was in your best interest to destroy all those copies. But yeah, there was something that was worth preserving and worth sharing to other communities. And that's why they were kept. They were passed around. Go ahead, Paul.
So is there any information on what the Corinth did after receiving this letter? Did they
No.
listen and get better, or did he ever go back and punish them? I've never heard of that.
We don't think, it doesn't look like he ever went back that we know of. There's no kind of record of any of that. And we don't know what happened to that community in their response to this letter. That's the tricky part. We just see this little tiny window into the relationship.
It very much reminds me of a parent who's telling a child they better be good or else, and then does nothing.
Or else. But he's got the big fish to fry, which is this very prestigious, well-established Christian community in Rome. And that's going to be, his emphasis is to prove himself through his letter of introduction to them. So,
Okay, one last question. How long after Paul died did the Romans decide to become Christians?
about 220 years.
Okay, yeah.
240, yeah. So, and they'll keep kind of incrementally growing over that time, so that when Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, Christians will make up 55% of the Roman Empire. So it's going to grow. It's basically going to double over time, and sequentially double and double and double until it hits this tipping point, which is when Constantine kind of says, okay, he's got to pull this together. He's got to get in bed with the Christians. That's my cynical speaking there. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, next up is Romans. If you have not read any of Paul's letters, this is the one I encourage you to read. This is really critical because what we've been reading and studying up into this point is letters back and forth by a prompt, right? There's something going on and he's clarifying it. He's already preached to these people and he's going to fill in the details, right? Put all of that aside. No relationship with the Romans, right? So he has to establish himself, which we know is important to him, right? So he's got to establish himself. And then he has to take them through his theology. And so, it is the big letter. It is the big letter that is going to spark Augustine and all the work that Augustine is going to do. It is the big letter that Martin Luther is this is what Luther is going to hinge his writing of the 95 Theses on. That's going to spark the Reformation. So this is the letter that includes basically everything Paul believes. And he's going to try to put it in a manner that, one, demonstrates his authority and opens the doors for him when he gets there, and two, make sure they know what he believes as he's walking in that door. So go ahead, Marilee.
I just had a question. We know that Paul started all these other churches. Who started the church in Rome?
So we don't know who started the church in Rome, but we know that it is one of the most ancient ones, that it was there within a few years of Christ dying, because it grew very fast. So when Paul goes to Rome, it is 25 years after Christ has died. And this is a big, thriving community, one of the biggest, one of the most thriving. So we don't know who started it. We don't know if it was leadership from Jerusalem that went. We don't know any of that kind of legacy history piece of the Roman community. We just know that they're big, they're thriving, they're mostly Gentiles. And very, very quickly, I think within 60 years, they are going to be the dominant center for Christianity across all of the empire.
Marci, question based on that. When did Peter go to Rome? I mean, on this rock I build my church and so forth and so on.
Yeah. So he heads to Rome, I think around the mid to late 50s, and they both die in the early 60s. Peter and Paul.
So Peter wasn't there much longer than Paul was.
I don't believe so, but I'll check on that, Bernie. Go ahead, Liz.
Well, you say it was a thriving community, so it was not a hidden community at this particular stage. All that came later after the persecutions and so forth. So they were able to practice in the open, as it were.
Yeah. And I'll pull some of that history back out that we did on the Roman Church that we did on ancient Christianity. So they were flying under the radar, and people knew they were there, but they weren't a problem. And then Nero, when he basically got in trouble because of these fires and he wanted someone to blame, and they were an easy blame. So that's when the first persecutions happened after that fire. And that's probably when Peter and Paul died. There's a little church in Rome it's one of my favorite churches in the world, because it has Michelangelo's carving of Moses. It's absolutely spectacular, but it also has this little grotto covered in candles, and it's the chain. It's the story is it's Peter's chains that he had in prison, and it's in that same little church, and they've been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
So,
Go ahead, Diane.
So it's interesting that the Christian community in Rome was Gentiles, because it was really Paul who was concentrating on that. Because isn't it true that Peter, they were really converting Jews to Christ?
Yeah.
Early. So who got that thing started? Maybe it was a woman. Maybe
There
it
were a
was-
lot of women leaders at the
Yeah.
time. Yeah, the women were,
That's why
Well,
they're remembered.
yeah, well, and women were funding it. So
Yeah.
that's where the early funds came from a lot of wealthy women. We do know that.
There also, has there been any studies whether slaves might have taken the religion from? I mean, slaves are moved around, bought and sold.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, Marilee. I don't know. I know that it was a very appealing religion for slaves, both current and former slaves. That message of universal love and welcome was very powerful.
Hmm.
Okay, everyone, I will let you go.